So when you walk, you release a lot of BDNF, which is the growth protein. It's like a fertilizer of the brain, some people will call it. That will also make your brain more plastic, for example. Walking, for example, in new territory, a concept called anticipatory proliferation, which is when you walk about a lot, you're signaling to your brain that you are a traveler, a guy on the savannah looking for new territory, and you're looking for a new home. So the brain says, I need to build new connections, new neurons perhaps, definitely new synaptic connections need to be laid down because I need to have these connections ready when I go to the new place. I have to be very plastic. Why else would a human being walk? It makes no sense, right? Other than new territory, new land. And so your brain in that way can prepare you for plasticity.
Dr. Jalal, you're a Harvard neuroscientist. You study a lot of things, but I want to talk about neuroplasticity and like changing our brain. And we were talking a little bit before we were recording, just fascinating stuff in general. But before we get into like any specific stuff, like what actually is neuroplasticity? Like what is this changing of the brain that people talk about?
I put a link down below for 30% off all things from Thrive Market on your first order. Now, they're not just about snacks and pantry staples. They've got good, legit, high protein foods, which is how I live. Even my snacks are high protein. Thing is, if you go to a grocery store, the high protein snacks, they're kind of playing games with you. Like they'll call it high protein, but you look at the ingredients and you realize that there's like some weird kind of like pea protein or something. Not that there's anything wrong with pea protein, but the reality is it's not what it seems on the surface. And it might only be 4 grams of protein. The thing I like about Thrive is you see what you get and you get what you see. It's transparent. So you can look at the ingredients and they're not gonna have garbage there and you're gonna be able to see it. And then it gets delivered right to your doorstep. So you're not having to spend time. Even myself, I know what to look for at a grocery store, but it takes me probably 25% longer to go grocery shopping than the average person because I do cross-reference everything that's in the ingredients. I don't like to bring that stuff into my house. Thrive Market takes that guesswork out of the equation for me, and it makes it accessible to me, but it makes it accessible to people all over the country. So that's what's really cool. So that link gets you 30% off your entire first grocery order and gets you a free $60 gift. Not to mention it gets delivered right to your doorstep, which is pretty darn cool, and their shipping is speedy, speedy fast. So that link down below.
Yeah, so Thomas, the brain is, as you know, just to give you an overall view here, you have the cortex, outer layer of the brain, 6 layers deep. It is 2 walnut-like structures that sits on the brain stem. And this is the overall layout of the brain. Put in very simplistic terms. Now, the brain for a very long time was thought to be very static, immobile, couldn't really change much. Now, you have a lot of modules in the brain. So there's 100 billion neurons that constitute the human brain. And it was thought that these neurons were static in their functions, meaning that they will not change. The circuits and the regions would forever stay the same. So let me give you an example. Now, for example, you have a region of the brain in the outer layer of the brain called the cortex that's important for movement, called the motor cortex, important for movement, moving your arm. And next to that, there's a region called the supplementary or premotor area that's important for planning movement. So whenever I plan to move my arms from A to B in space, neurons in the premotor regions will signal to the motor regions, move your hand, right? Move your leg. So you have that. Now, a stroke hits you in the motor region. Now, you cannot move your arm or your leg anymore. Left side of the brain hemisphere controls the right side of the body, vice versa. So you have this. So the stroke hits, let's say, the right motor cortex, you can no longer move your hand. Mind you, actually, in that motor region, there's a map of your entire body mapped onto your brain. So if the stroke hits a particular region of that map, you cannot move your arm. So it's not the whole side, but sometimes it can be the whole legs and the arm. Obviously, what happens at this point, there's a lot of shock. It's called cortical shock, and the brain is in a sense of toxicity, inflammation. You develop a paralysis of the arm. It cannot move. When you go through rehab, the doctors will help you move that arm again. So they will have you do certain exercises and things like that to help recruit other neurons in neighboring regions to do that function. So the brain can use its other regions to adopt a certain function, if that makes sense. So yes, you have certain specific neurons for movement. Now the brain start using other neurons for that function. We thought for a long time that there's a limits to that. Obviously there are limits, but the limits are small. There's very little change going on. If you have a paralysis, you can make it work slightly, perhaps, if you train it a lot by utilizing and recruiting new neurons. But we now know with plasticity, in fact, that you can have great changes, lots of changes, up to 14 centimeters. It has been found in monkeys, for example, of change. In human brain, it's not necessarily as much, but there's vast territories of brain regions that can change and change function by simply experiences and sensory input. Now, for plasticity to occur, there's certain criteria, there's certain rules. You can't just go around changing your brain. If that was the case, our brains would change all the time. Our brains do change, but not all the time. It has to change in response to, well, the neurochemistry has to be right. So, for example, we have a system in the brain. I call it, it's called the attention system, nucleus specialis. It's a region of the brain, and deeper, relatively speaking. That region of the brain produces neurons that produce, or has neurons in there that produce acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is important for movement. It's a neurochemical that the brain uses for moving, and attention, high levels of attention. So when I want to change my brain, I have to have acetylcholine, a lot of acetylcholine rampant in my brain. Now, let's say I'm walking about in Los Angeles, visiting Thomas and visiting his studio. This is novel territory. I don't come to Los Angeles very often, right? So my brain, what does it release? A lot of acetylcholine. Why? Because I have to have attention. Look at the streets. Look at this mountain. You want to know this pathway because you may get lost. You have to lay down new circuits because you may need this to survive a tumultuous attack by a tiger later in the day. Everything is novel. You release a lot of acetylcholine. Now, in a previous video, we talked about sleep and REM sleep. We have a lot of acetylcholine during REM sleep. But it turns out even babies, they have a lot of acetylcholine. They have acetylcholine all the time. It's the nucleus specialis system is on all the time. Why is this the case? Well, unlike you and I, Thomas, they don't know what to pay attention to, right? They don't know what's important, what's mom and dad, and what's, if you're 2 years old, everything is novel. You want to have a lot of acetylcholine in order to have a lot of plasticity. Obviously, babies have a lot of REM too, so they have a lot of acetylcholine in REM as well. And for that reason, they can encode new information and have plasticity shaping their brain because of this. When you're not traveling, when you're going about your daily life, like me as a neuroscientist, go to the lab, not a lot of novelty. So my attention systems, for the most part, it's routine, not a lot of attention. I go about a computer doing the same tasks, same Uber rides, everything is the same. There's not lack of novelty. So you need acetylcholine. Often you don't have it as much, but as children you have it in tons. Once you reach 13, 14 years of age, less acetylcholine. There's a closing, it's called the critical period, that period from 0 to 9 or 12. It's called the critical period. That's why language, like for me, for Balan, when I speak English, you can hear there's a clear accent. Like your mom, I'm Danish, Kurdish from Iraq originally, but Danish. So I have this blended accent of English. That's not very clear, it's not 100% clear. That's because I learned English at a relatively late age. Had I learned it when I was 7 or 8, I might have been fluent, and you wouldn't have the accent because of my acetylcholine systems and plasticity being rampant and making my brain more able to change more.
Interesting. So let's just get to the meat and potatoes of it. I mean, how can we influence plasticity? I mean, I think people started to get a little warmed up to the idea of plasticity. Wim Hof talked about it a little bit. Then you've got people like when all the mushroom coffees and the lion's mane and things, like that was the embryonic stages of like the masses starting to understand.
Yep.
Obviously it had been in the research world much longer than that. But I mean, that's when the public was like, wait a minute, like we can actually alter like plasticity, we can change. We know the meditation can obviously have this impact, but like what are ways that we influence this? How do we actually?
Well, it's a great question. So plasticity, we want to change by recruiting this system. By harnessing the system of the acetylcholine nucleus basalis attention system. Now, that can be obtained in a more natural way by traveling, for example. Traveling, you go to new places, your brain automatically turns on the attention system. The dopaminergic system is also critical and important for plasticity. Novelty, you have that with dopamine. You have the attention system with traveling. Everything is novel, and so this is one key thing that you can do. Now, as we age and become more static in our ways of living, I do the same thing. Thomas does the same thing, comes to the studio, same path, drive, everything is the same. Well, what if you go out and learn a new language? When you learn a new language, attention system is critically on. It's on all the time. Well, not all the time, but it's on when you're learning that language, and that spills over to overall plasticity. So it makes your brain more plastic overall by focusing on the single task in your life, and in that way making your brain more plastic. Learning new skills late into adult life, learning a new sport. It has to be radically new. You can't just do soccer and then do another variation of soccer. It has to be enough to engage your attention systems and make you hyper-focused and attentive to that. And ideally, you want to have a dopaminergic component, so there's a pleasurability to it, a reward to it.
Don't just do something miserable because that's different.
That's different, right? That's not going to work. So you want to have that pleasurable component to it. So the dopamine is going on, and acetylcholine, attention and pleasure, and these are keys for plasticity. Now, what else can you do then? Is there other tricks you can do?
Can the opposite be true though too? Can you also like put yourself into intense hardship, and will that trigger neuroplasticity in a way to protect you?
Hardship meaning?
Like, okay, you said like it can be a new experience, but it can be something miserable. Like, okay, I want to go to the middle of Alberta, Canada in winter, and and to make it, and it's a terrible experience, but it's still novel.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing against Alberta. I'm just saying it would be probably negative 50 degrees and be miserable. Like, I mean, that's not necessarily dopaminergic, but could it actually be something so extreme that it's like hard? Like again, like Wim Hof, like doing something difficult where you're doing like ice baths, something like that. Like clearly, you're forging some new pathway with a hormetic stressor, but just wondering if it has to be something you love or can it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I want to say that yes, if you are planned to, let's say, I take you and I put you at Iceland, for example. It's cold. You have to survive. It's very hard, but there's going to be a lot of. You are very focused on survival at that point. Everything is novel, and you are hyper attentive in a sense. If it's life threatening and it's hard, now you might say, well, there's not a lot of pleasure here. There's not a lot of dopamine, perhaps. Well, there are dopamine. Each time you survive something or you find a new stone or a new path, there automatically will be some pleasurable component to that discovery. So that's a huge part of it. So dopamine, let's think about it in a ways where it can be escaping less pain.
True.
So you can have more dopamine that way, and there's going to be a pleasurable component to that.
That's true. Yeah.
But simply by walking, actually, so when you walk a lot, and I know you have videos on this, I've seen them and they're great. So walking a lot is great so when you walk, you release a lot of BDNF, which is the growth protein. It's like a fertilizer of the brain, some people will call it. That will also make your brain more plastic, for example. BDNF, GDNF, the glia type of growth factors and other growth factors. So if you do cardiovascular exercise as well, so these are supplementary, you can do that as well. Walking, for example, in new territory, a concept called anticipatory proliferation, which is when you walk about a lot, you're signaling to your brain that you are a traveler, a guy on the savannah looking for new territory, and you're looking for a new home. So the brain says, I need to build new connections, new neurons perhaps, neurogenesis perhaps, even though neurogenesis may be less more rare than we think, but definitely new synaptic connections need to be laid down because I need to have these connections ready when I go to the new place. I have to be very plastic. Why else would a human being walk? It makes no sense, right? Other than new territory, new land. And so your brain in that way can prepare you for plasticity. So a lot of walking can be beneficial. Cardiovascular exercise, as we mentioned. Lowering stress. We talked about stress in the previous video, but cortisol directly blocks BDNF and growth factors that will increase plasticity, increase it. So sleep, when you don't sleep, cortisol goes up. Cortisol inhibits BDNF and GDNF and growth factors, you have less plasticity. Sleeping a lot, not sleeping tons, but having a sufficient quality sleep, exercising, learning new skills, playfulness, being playful, known to reduce stress, and then the downstream of that is more plasticity by having less cortisol as well.
What about, speaking of playfulness, what about oxytocin? Does that influence plasticity?
It does
Yeah.
a ton. So plasticity, think of oxytocin as the hormone that makes us bond. Now, if I am a very selfish person, for example, I'm very selfish, I'm very self-indulged, it's all about me, ego. I'm the teenager into his 20s and 30s, right? Now this guy, he gets a kid. And he wants this child to survive. He wants this child which has his genetic material. He needs this child to survive. But how is that possible if he's perpetually egotistical and selfish? So what it does, the brain does with oxytocin and a lot of oxytocin in the system, it will allow you to, it makes the brain more plastic. It just makes the brain more able to adapt by using oxytocin as the trigger of plasticity in this case. So it has that effect because now then you can change your brain by going into this relationship with this child, being less selfish. Even with a woman, the woman that your partner, when you find her, initially you might be self-indulgent and egotistical. When you fall in love and you bond with this lady, a lot of oxytocin, and you see a change in yourself, and you go, my God, things are different. You look at life differently as well, and you have plastic changes. A globalization occurs of your brain with plasticity in this case. So definitely, that's part of it. Oxytocin, it's part of the plasticity process.
The more adequate sleep that you get, is your brain more plastic during your waking hours? We know that obviously your brain is plastic during REM sleep, but better quality sleep, does that lead to better overall neuroplasticity?
It does. It does. So deep sleep, and especially REM sleep, is critical for plasticity in itself. So that makes your brain more plastic as you are sleeping. And then we can think about sleep as an extension of daily activity, where plasticity's ramp is fired up more. You just have more plasticity. So that part of it's clear, and that for most people they will have plasticity in those stages. Of course, as you age, as we said, you have less REM sleep and in fact less plasticity. Now, the question was, sorry, it just gave me.
Oh, does the plasticity sort of continue into your waking hours?
It does. So if you have better sleep quality, that just simply, and this is obviously a simplification, but you just have less cortisol, less stress that can inhibit these growth factors. And also, if you have less acetylcholine, or you have less focus, noradrenaline, you can focus less on things. Like the systems fall apart in some basic ways. Yeah. But when sleep is derails, when sleep falls apart, the whole architecture of your neurochemicals and your chemistry falls apart, and you will just have less playfulness, less attention, and more cortisol and stress, which all leads to less plasticity.
No, I think one thing that people think is that plasticity would be all sunshine and rainbows. I would imagine if you're highly neuroplastic, that there could also be maladaptive things that could happen, right? So if you're neuroplastic and you start developing bad habits, you're quite literally more inclined to root those new habits, right?
Oh yeah, that's true. So plasticity can also explain things like mental disorders, the brain changing, right? So you have anxiety, you have a traumatic event, just use the traumatic, something bad happens to you, something traumatic, and your brain starts to shrink in certain parts of the brain. It rewires itself. This is a maladaptive form of plasticity. You don't want a trigger of a negative nature to affect your brain and allow it to shrink and allow other parts to take over that are more emotional. So, and here I talk about negative affect, negative emotions, obviously. You don't want that to be too active in that sense and structurally start growing in size. Now the question would then be, another example actually that I just thought about was in people with autism. It's thought that their plasticity lasts longer than the average person. And that's so their brain becomes hyperplastic in a way. And so they start making more connections than the usual person, and they can't shut down the window of the nucleus basalis attention system. They cannot shut it down appropriately, and so they have some of their symptoms could potentially be explained by that. So that's something that's...
Yeah, there's even talk that there's so much potential in neuroplasticity that they might be more aware of senses that we're not really aware of, like energies and things like that, where it's like when they're in crowds, like that's what maybe they shut down because they actually sense things that we don't sense because there's more plasticity.
Great point. Exactly, Thomas. So they're hypersensitive to sound. Some of them, they have like what's called phonophobia, or some are light sensitive. I'm a little bit light sensitive, not autism. But so you can have these things, right? And these are sensory regions of the brain being hyperconnected with other regions, causing these hyperactivity in some of these circuits. Absolutely. So that can be caused by something like hyperplasticity lasting much longer than the expected critical period. But the critical period is important. It goes back all the way to like Hubel and Wiesel, some of these sleep researchers at Harvard I'd be 50 years ago. It's a long time ago. I can't remember the exact date, but they did some studies showing that in kittens, when you sew the eye of a kitten in this like the 3 to 8 weeks period of its life, you sew it and then you open the eye, it will actually be blind for life, because the brain is so hyperplastic, and obviously in a negative way, because they'll be blind for life. If they don't get the sensory input at an early age, that part of the brain, the left eye, the right visual cortex in the back of the brain will die, shrink. Now, critically, what's interesting here is that not only will it die, but the reason for the right eye, the left visual cortex, will take over the right side. So it will invade it. It will say, oh, since this region of the brain is not being used, I will use it. I won't let anything go to waste in the human brain. And so you have plasticity being an example of get a doubling of the eye that's not blind. And this is a principle, by the way, in the brain. So whenever you have people, for example, let's say somebody with phantom limbs, they have a limb cut off, and this is something that can happen. If you cut off if you have you find yourself in a motorcycle accident, your limb is amputated. In some cases, you will develop what's called a phantom limb, a vivid sensation of a ghost-like limb in the air that can move. It can say hello, it can speak, and it can do a lot of things. Have you heard about this?
Yep.
Right. So phantom limbs is such an interesting phenomenon. But it turns out then that if you stroke their cheek, you will feel the phantom sensations as if you're touching their non-existent arm in their cheek. Why is that the case? It turns out the face area and the arm area in the brain, I mentioned before that the body is mapped on to in the brain. There's a body map on the brain in the sensory regions as well in the motor regions. And it happens that the face region is right next to the arm region. And so if you're not using the arm because it's gone, it's been amputated, the face region will invade and take over the arm and say, I have a double sensitive face now. So this is something that occurs all the time in the human brain. When you are not using a certain skill, let's say, I know how to play the guitar or play the piano. Motor neurons, important for that skill, will start to expand. They will become larger in the map in my brain. My brain will literally, those areas will become larger and larger and larger. I have some other skill. Let's say playing the piano is my new skill. I do it 10 hours a day, or 4 hours a day for 6 months, attentively learning this new skill. my areas that has to do with piano playing and my fingers and sensitivity will cause a expansion of that region of the brain, whereas my other skill of, let's say, playing tennis will become less and less because it's invading. So this is happening all the time with competing brain regions taking over and competing for territory.
So then you mentioned before we were filming about the effect of art, right? So, and just simply, and before we get into like how doing art or creative aspects can like change the brain and make you more, do that kind of thing. It is true that like people are born as either more left brain, right brain, like creative type people versus, so A, is that very much so a real thing? And B, is it possible to become the other? Or is it possible to become the other?
Great question. I love this question. So left brain, right brain, is this a true phenomenon? It turns out it is. There is some truth to it. I don't mean it's in the pop psychology sense that everything is left and everything logical is in the left and everything emotional is in the right. And not in that crude sense, but there's some truth to this. For example, this is called laterality in scientific terms, meaning there is some functions that are more amplified in the left versus the right. So for example, language is in the left hemisphere. We know there's a region of the brain called the Wernicke's area. It has to do with understanding language, semantics. It connects through wires to a region called the Broca's area. It has to do with speech and grammatical structure of language. Have a stroke in the Wernicke's, you can no longer understand language. I've seen this, it's spooky. I know a colleague of mine, she had a stroke there, she doesn't understand language. She speaks very well, there's no grammatical issues, but she cannot understand language. Highly selective function. Had the same stroke occurred in the right hemisphere, there would have been no issues with language. So there's actual structures there and a fiber that connects them. So that's left hemisphere. Right is more involved in spatial body mapping my spatial orientation, things in space. I have a sense of a body image and sensing things in space, right hemisphere. Left, there's a region of the brain that's involved in, seems to be numbers and serial thinking and to some extent metaphors. It's called the angular gyrus. It's 6 times bigger than us than for example, or actually the angular gyrus itself, it's a region in the parietal region, meaning it's up here. By the way, let me know, Thomas, if I'm using too much.
No, you're good.
Okay, good. So there's a region up here that's involved in metaphors and understanding and mathematical thinking, it seems. Same part of the brain in the right hemisphere, the angular gyrus, is involved in artistic expression and painting and art. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So there's a clear golden thread running through this. Now, this part of the brain, by the way, it's absent in monkeys. So it seems to be unique to us. If you have a stroke in that region of the brain, metaphor go away, a metaphor blind, or you lose the ability to do math. We've seen people like this. They cannot do simple mathematics. Everything else is fine. They can speak, talk to me, have a chat, they're nice, everything is okay. But then you say, subtract 7 from 9, they go into a coma. They can't do anything. Not literally coma, but they get all worried and they can't do it. Right side of the brain, you get a stroke, you lose the ability to paint, for example, or do anything artistic. Now, there seems like the brain, and this is a principle, by the way, of the brain overall, that there's a lot of cross-inhibitory dance going on, where the left hemisphere is inhibiting the right and the right inhibiting the left. There's a constant inhibition going on, cross-inhibitory function of the brain. We mentioned the prefrontal inhibiting the emotional, the logical, rational inhibiting the emotional. And this is a concept overall you find in the brain, a lot of cross-inhibition going on. Now, many a neurologist will tell you that when a patient has a stroke to a part of the brain, they might suddenly get artistic talent flourishing. And they overnight become like Da Vinci and start painting things that are surreal sometimes. Or sometimes if they get a stroke in the other part of the brain, they might develop let's say mathematical abilities, like savant abilities, where they can do, they can do calculations that are out of this world. And the question is what's going on, right? What's going on in these abilities? Why would they suddenly flourish and come to the fore, and what does it tell us about the human brain? There's, I would say, two sides to this. The first thing is the following, is that it's called the principle of isolation, is that when you use a structure a lot, and we talked a little bit about this in terms of with the motor skills and the piano and all that. When you use a structure a lot, it grows and it becomes hypertrophied. It can grow, the neurons can grow there, and the circuits can, or the area can grow stronger and bigger, and you allocate more attention to it. So now imagine if you get let's say the stroke hits the left hemisphere. You can no longer do simple math, but also the left hemisphere can no longer inhibit its buddy on the right, the artistic side, and he starts painting overall. What happens then? The painting goes up and you become highly artistic. In fact, there were some studies done by, I believe it was Bruce Miller at UCSF, looked at people with frontal temporal dementia, meaning the frontal lobes and temporal lobes were deteriorating because of this dementia, but they developed highly artistic talents over short periods. Why? Well, because the prefrontal is also inhibiting some of these artistic latent abilities all the time, and so these could just come to the surface and flare up, and you would see artistic talents coming about. And you see this in autistic children, for example. There's a case of a girl called Nadia who could draw paintings, a horse that was more evocative and like it looked more realistic and beautiful than anything Da Vinci could paint. And it's actually compared with Michelangelo, I think. There was a painting of one of these Renaissance painters and Nadia's painting of a horse, it looked like it was leaping out of the canvas. I mean, it was gorgeous with his muscles, and it seems like that part of the brain that has to do with conjuring up images, which is the artistic region of the brain, conjuring up images and, creating, proper, impressions of this, was hypertrophied in Nadia because she was an autistic child. She could barely speak, left hemisphere. She could barely tie her shoelaces. She had all these limits of her left hemisphere, but her right hemisphere was growing all the time, getting all the share of the attentional load, and it was growing. Now, when she became a teenager, her left hemisphere recovered somehow, and what you saw as well was her talent kind of went away as well.
Oh man,
it's crazy.
So. Can you feed these systems a little, like, so by doing things like art and things like that, can you would that necessarily, like, if you, okay, say you've got a baseline where you're equally good at math and equally good at art, and you start doing a lot more art. I mean, by that inhibitory effect, I mean, essentially, you would, in theory, start losing some of your mathematical ability, even if it's not measurable. I mean, maybe it's a good question. So in the normal human brain, without any obvious pathology or any blows that would cause it to change in a more radical way, yes, if you start painting all the time and you use the art module in the brain, the inferior parietal lobule is a part of that structure. I don't want to overwhelm you with these names, but it's just I think it's interesting because if there's a stroke to that part of the brain, the artistic region of the brain, you also lose the ability to dream as well. So it shows us there's a hyperconnection between creating images in the brain, artistic expression, dreams are like big visual metaphors, right? And then creating art. These are all connected in some ways, right? So you see here. Yeah. But then if you start painting, as you say, all the time, what happens? It turns out then, yes, I would definitely, that structure of the brain would expand over time if it was done attentively and done in a continuous manner. Now, we know a principle in neuroscience and plasticity called mass practice, is that if you practice things in 4 or 5 hour bouts versus just doing it 1 hour every day, that creates more plasticity. So I would suggest doing it like 4 or 5 hour blocks every single day, if the aim is plasticity, obviously. So if you do these practices in bouts of like 4 or 5 hours at a time, deeply immerse yourself in the activity, well, that can be a doorway to plasticity because you are engaging the circuits in a repetitive, immersed blocks, and then you just repeat this over time as well. So it's done, let's say, 2 weeks of immersed practice of painting, and then again, take a little break, and then solidify those circuits by doing the mass practice again. And that also gets us to another thing which is related, is that if I was to learn a new language, say Balan was to learn a new language, I study, let's say, Chinese every day for an hour. I study Chinese every day for an hour, 2 months, 3 months.
Or if I use the same amount of time for, moving to China and having mass practice of Chinese, what would be more effective?
Definitely the mass practice.
Mass practice. So definitely any skill you want to have, plasticity, mass practice is always better. With the caveat, you have to then have space, it's called sort of space type of learning, where you then repeat the stuff over time, so it's not only 2 weeks of learning and then neglecting that thing.
Yeah, probably proper integration, right? So
absolutely.
I think we've seen this in some of the meditation research, like longer bouts of meditation done moderately infrequently are better than like a daily practice of 20 minutes, right? Even though that's probably just more achievable for people to just do 20 minutes every day, and that's great, but like I can personally attest to these people are going to think I'm crazy, but I do it. I've done 3-4 hours of meditation and then not meditate for a week and take that time to integrate. And it's a noticeable difference in the benefits that you carry over. I mean, a noticeable difference. And I know a lot of the plasticity research has come, in the meditation world. They've done a lot of that. So fascinating. But with so even if someone is, so it's not necessarily volume dependent per se. So like if someone were to, like with the language example, like you say, okay, you're immersed in that culture, so you're going to like soak it up. So one could say, well, yeah, you're just immersed in it so that the sheer volume is more. Yeah. But even if it was equal hours. So if you were to say, if you could magically teleport to China and be there 4 hours per day and immersed in it 4 hours per day, that would the time equivalent would be the same as far as, but you would get more. Do you know, like roughly, is it significantly more? Is it just marginally more?
It's significantly more. It should be much more. So I'll give you a concrete example. There was a guy called Edward Taub. He's a neurologist. He had a treatment for stroke. So he had patients with a stroke, so an arm that's not working. And this patient, he will bring him in and he will have them immersed in rehabilitation, where every single day for 4 or 5 hours, they will be forced to use the unused arm. And by the way, some of these folks had strokes that damaged and caused the paralysis since childhood. So they have had this paralysis for a long time. The reason I'm saying this is that the longer it's been paralyzed, the less chances of actually getting some movement and mobility back in the arm. Now, what they did in some of these studies, for 2 weeks, they would have them use the arm. So they say, use the arm, and they would do something called what is the word for that? It's constrained. They would have a constraint. I forgot the term, but it's like a constrainment where they would have their right arm completely, bound like this, so they couldn't move it and use it, and they were forced to use the left arm for 5 hours a day. So imagine if it's a paralyzed arm, you try to move and reach out for a glass, and you can't. But you keep going. Attention is on the arm all the time. And then what the doctors would do in that rehab center, they would give them like a reward each time they moved it a little bit. Get the dopamine on. So that's a dopamine component. It turned out 4 or 5 hours a day for 2 weeks and made them double like some of these functions so they could use the arm. So it was twice as effective as non-using this therapy or just using something else. And in some cases, what you had was the motor neurons in the brain that would correspond to that left arm that they had been dead from the stroke. The neurons there were dead. Neurons in the premotor regions, that means regions just next to it, adjacent to it, that's involved in planning movement, would take over the function of the motor region. So no longer would they just plan, but it had a career shift and started to use its functions for movement. And in other cases, neurons on the opposite motor neurons, on the opposite side that's supposed to work for this working hand, started to have a double job and working for this arm now. So motor neurons here, that's supposed to work for this arm only, now starts working for this. Incredible. 2 weeks of they do brain scans and they'd see this amazing changes and it seems the key window for change was about 3 hours. So you don't necessarily have to do it 6 hours or 5 hours. Perhaps 3 hours was sufficient to generate those changes.
Wow. So what are some takeaways that people can take out of this to implement, if you had to say, okay, well, here's a few things that you can do to really change your brain?
Oh, yeah. So this brings us to constraint-induced. That's the word I was looking for before that I couldn't get. It's called constraint-induced therapy. So whenever you want to learn a new skill, and this gets to your point of whether it's hard or not, hardship. Obviously, this was very hard, right? It was a very hard treatment to do, but it generated the changes they needed, the plasticity they needed from using their paralyzed arm. If you want to take that and use this principle for everyday life, I would say, if you want to learn a new language, not only immerse yourself in that culture, but also make sure that you don't have access to people that can translate, people like English-speaking people. Like when I was, as I mentioned before, I used to live in Egypt. I didn't speak Arabic. I learned Arabic very quickly within 6 months, year, because I would hang out with the common folks and speak Arabic with them, and I didn't have anybody, they couldn't speak English, and I would learn it from immersion and just not having my arm, like not having, couldn't use it, so I was constraint induced in that way, right? Constraint induced. So that's a key part of this. This constraint inducement principle is powerful. Let me give you one example from the animal world, if you don't mind. So you have monkeys. You cut their sensory nerves from the arm, cut the sensory nerves from the left arm, and then you touch their arm, they can't feel a thing. You would expect that. You cut the sensory nerves. There are nerves here, that's peripheral nerves, sensory, going up all the way to the spinal cord and the brain, sensory regions of the brain. If you cut the nerves here, all the fibers, they cannot feel the arm. But what happened was, interestingly, monkeys, when they had the sensory nerves cut, they couldn't move their arm either. So the arm was paralyzed as well. Crazy stuff, right? This made scientists think for a long time that sensory regions of the brain and sensory fibers are responsible for movement. But then came along a scientist and said, well, look, this is interesting, but it doesn't make sense. I mean, these are sensory fibers. Motor regions are different. Let's look into this. The same monkeys, now mind you, this arm is paralyzed for life after chopping off the sensory neurons. Now, ironically, if you then put a bandage or something around, a rope around his right arm, after about 3 or 6 months, he will start using his arm again. It's no longer paralyzed for life. It's crazy. It tells you how the reason why his arm was paralyzed for life was he's never, after the paralysis and stroke and the sense of like the cortical and the shock, actually this was a shock in the level of the spinal cord, which we call a spinal shock of the surgeries and removing the sensory fibers, that caused them not to use the arm. Are you following with me?
Yeah.
Okay, make sure. Okay. Now then what happens is, once this arm can't be used and they are forced to use the paralyzed arm, the plasticity will make sure that they start learning and starting to learn the arm. Ironically, even more bizarre, if you cut all the fibers from the left and the right arm, right, and then what you do is constrain both arms for about 6 months for all the inflammation to go away, they will now be able to use both arms after a while. Is that crazy?
That is wild.
That's wild. One arm, one sensory fiber, without any constraining anything, it would be paralyzed for life, no matter what. All the monkeys, paralysis for life. But once you constrain and force them to use that limb, it's a completely different affair. Point of all this long story is the following. Constraining you, forcing you to use that skill on the Iceland, in the mountains, using that spear or hunting down those predators or whatever you have to learn, that's the key to plasticity. You're forced. You have attentive focus, life-threatening. You feel rewarded each time you use your arm or whatever you have to use, and that's where the plasticity comes about. Mass practice at massive levels.
Man, and you could even apply that into workouts, I could imagine. I mean, it's like if everyone has like kind of a dominant side in athletics and you're trying to like even it out, it's almost like you can strain the other side and train that way. I bet you that is fascinating, man. Well, where can everyone find you, my man?
I'm on Dr. Balan Jalal on YouTube. I am on Instagram at Balan Jalal and on Facebook at Balan Jalal.
Right on, my man. Well, thanks for coming out.
Thank you very much, brother.